So this is lecture number 4, if you're keeping track. And just quickly, what we've seen so far, think about it, we've seen all 13 of the English colonies along the East Coast established. We've spent more time on some than others, but we've seen them all established. We've looked at the differences between them, both within the northern colonies, within the southern colonies, and compared the two. We've also seen the Enlightenment, the Great Awakening, these developments that were shared experiences that brought the colonies together. But what are we headed for now? Right, revolution. So before we get to the lead up to the American Revolution, the conflict between Britain and the colonies that ultimately leads to the War for Independence, first, the 7 Years' War. And that is the long-building war between Britain and France for control of North America. This has been coming for a long time, and both sides really knew it. So, if we look at just the map of the control of North America, and this is what the countries claimed, and of course, as they always did, this ignores the people who actually lived there, right? The various native groups that still lived across all of North America. But in terms of European control, the yellow on this map is what the British claimed. And so you see that part up there in the far north, and you shouldn't really think of that as a great advantage because it's bitterly cold up there, and the British used that primarily for a fur trade that they had got into as well. So that's very sparsely populated. Almost no British people actually up there. This is where the British population is highly concentrated, right? The colonies along the East Coast that we've spent so much time talking about their early history. Where did the French first settle? Right, up in Canada, Quebec, and then moving down the river from there. And then remember that they explored the waterways, and they came down the Mississippi River, and that's why you see the French stretching through Canada and then all the way through the great middle of North America. And that's because of all the trade connections that they had built with native groups along these river systems. So when you just look at the areas that they controlled, and by the way, you still see the Spanish down in Florida, right? And then in the southwest. But if we just look at the British and the French and what they controlled, it appears from here that the French were in a pretty strong position. But that's deceptive. Because the British, remember, had come to settle, to actually take over the lands and to live there. And the French were still primarily here for trade. So this map shows the areas that were actually settled, where French people actually lived. So you see that great big bunch of green there. You might imagine that filled with Frenchmen, but of course that's just not the case. The French were in these scattered little X's you see here with the yellow. And those were trading posts and occasionally missions and military forts. But then, out here along the East Coast, this great concentration of English people packed in here. Remember the immigrants that we mentioned earlier, the German and Scots-Irish immigrants who had come in and settled in the British colonies and been allowed to move in with a simple promise of allegiance to the British king? Well, part of the reason that Britain had implemented that policy and allowed all these immigrants to come move in is that they knew eventually a war with France would come. And remember, the immigrants settled along the frontier. And where will the fighting be in a war with France? Primarily along the frontier. When the war finally came, in all these areas that you see here, the French had 100,000 French settlers. 100,000. While the British, here along the eastern seaboard, in these settled areas, the British had 2.5 million settlers. 2.5 million to 100,000. So, everyone knew, as the war approached, that it would not just be a war between the British settlers and the French settlers. Whose side would natives in general take? The French. Because the French, remember, are not here to take the land. And in general, although they've caused all kinds of conflicts between native people, they're on good terms with the native people around their settlements. And more than thinking that native people love the French, it's important to realize that native people understood that the British were just a greater threat, because they're here to take over the lands and build new settlements. So most native people, it was understood, would side with the French. But the most important native group was the Iroquois Confederacy, who we've talked about now for a long time in this class. And the Iroquois, remember, played the French and the Dutch against each other once they had eliminated the Hurons. And then, when they lost the Dutch, they played the French and the British against each other. So they're savvy and they're tough fighters. And which side the Iroquois would take was critical. And the best way to think of it is like this. If the Iroquois side with the British, the French don't have a chance. But if the Iroquois side with the French, they do have a chance. Now notice I did not say if they side with the French will win, right? That's not the case. But if they side with the French really do have a shot, even though they're so dramatically outnumbered. The Iroquois siding with the French would bring in other Indian groups who would try to stay neutral. All of this is building slowly, and so maneuvering for when it came was happening, although nobody knew what would actually set off the conflict. What did it, ultimately, were disputed lands out here in the Ohio River Valley. Lands where the French had been trading with natives for a long time, but British settlers were now moving in and causing anger among those native groups, who then go to the French. It was a group of Virginia militiamen, led by a young Virginian named George Washington. So this is the Virginia militia, and they traveled out into the Ohio River Valley and constructed a military fort, which they called Fort Necessity, because they need it, they think. So they build Fort Necessity out in what the French have long claimed as their lands, and what natives, of course, think of as theirs. So native people go to the French, and the French organize a military expedition who discover Fort Necessity and really humiliated the young George Washington and his Virginia militiamen. So it was a crushing defeat for young George Washington, who hoped that one day he'd get to improve his military reputation. But we'll have to see if that ever works out for him. So Washington and the Virginia militiamen slink home in defeat. But it was this little fight over Fort Necessity, which is really a pretty small military engagement, that was the sign that a full-out war was coming soon. Knowing that a war was coming soon, a prominent, wealthy British settler here in the colonies named Benjamin Franklin organized a convention, a congress, in Albany, in upstate New York. Franklin was famous already. He had established a famous almanac. He was a printer. He was, in many ways, a self-made man. He had retired in his early 40s and devoted himself to science and the Enlightenment. So Franklin was really like the first kind of celebrity made here in the colonies. Famous. Franklin saw that now an all-out war with France was on its way. So Franklin organized this meeting in Albany with two objectives. The first was to try to get the colonies to unite together. He was convinced that if the colonies tried to fight France as 13 separate governments, the French could defeat them. So that was the first goal, to try to unite the 13 colonies together. The second goal was to try to get the Iroquois to side with the British. That, of course, is why they organized it in Albany. Because where do the Iroquois live? Right near the Great Lakes, upstate New York. So the Iroquois were invited, and Franklin invited delegates from all 13 colonies. But not every colony sent delegates. So the idea of uniting together was so unappealing that many of the colonies didn't even send anyone to participate. But many of the most powerful colonies did, so it still held importance. And the Iroquois came as well. The British delivered gifts to the Iroquois and tried to persuade them to side with them, the British, in this upcoming war. Iroquois delegation listened very politely. They accepted all the gifts, and then, very politely, they told the British, no. Now, they did not say they were going to side with the French. In fact, they said they would not side with the French. Instead, the Iroquois said that they would remain neutral, that they were going to stay out of this. In reality, what do you think they're doing? Exactly. They want to wait and see how the war goes, and then make sure that they wind up on the winning side. Now, of course, they don't say that part. For now, they just claim that they're going to remain neutral. And so that first goal of the Albany Congress failed. The second goal, remember, was to try to unite the colonies together. Franklin's argument, again, was that if the colonies were divided, they could be killed. So they needed to join together, or they would die separately. So Franklin proposed what he called a plan of union. A plan of union to try to unite the colonies together. His idea was what he called a colonial council, a new government that would have representation from each of the 13 colonies. And this new government that he's proposing, this colonial council, would then have the power to raise an army, consisting of men from all the colonies. And they would also have the power to collect taxes from all the colonies. Now, Franklin was a magnetic personality and an 18th century celebrity, especially to other political actors here in the colonies. And some really did see the merit of his ideas. And he persuaded the delegates at Albany to agree to his plan. Success. Not so fast. Because then, those delegates who went to the Albany Congress, they had to go back to their home colonies, back to Virginia and Pennsylvania, and then they had to try to persuade the colonial legislatures to agree to the plan of union. And at that point, every colonial legislature said no. They all rejected Franklin's plan. Why? Well, kind of. The way they see it, if they agree to this plan, they'd be giving up the powers that they have always held. Who organizes the militia in each colony? Right, it's through the colonial legislature. Who has always taxed the people of each colony directly? It's the colonial legislatures. So the way they see it, they would be surrendering their power to some new government. And they all refused. So we're going to stop right here, and then things will pick up from here next time.